Avery Johnson believed success would shield her from prejudice. Each morning, she entered the glass tower of a powerful tech company, sharp, capable, and alone as the only black woman among white colleagues. She built the company's most valuable project and earned praise from a boss who claimed he trusted talent, not skin color. But behind polite smiles, resentment grew. While Avery stayed late perfecting the project, someone else was stealing it, using her name, her access, her reputation. When the truth surfaced, it was too late. The project was leaked. Millions were lost. And Avery stood alone in a courtroom defending herself against a system that had already judged her. Then her boss took the stand and called, trusting her a mistake. What no one knew was that a small green plant on Avery's desk had been watching everything. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe some heroes are willing to look guilty to save the innocent, this story is for you. Seattle woke up under a soft curtain of rain, the kind that didn't storm. It simply stayed, turning sidewalks dark and glass buildings into mirrors. A cold wind rolled in from the water, carrying the smell of salt and coffee. Morning commuters moved like shadows beneath umbrellas, headlights smearing into long, pale streaks across wet streets. Avery Johnson walked through it with her coat buttoned high, her laptop bag hugged close to her side. She always walked the last block to work, not because she had to, because she needed those 60 seconds of air before entering a place that made her feel like she was holding her breath. Avery Johnson was 32, medium height, and built like someone who had learned to carry weight without asking for help. Strong shoulders, steady posture, the kind of calm you only get after surviving years of being underestimated. Her skin was a deep brown with warm undertones, her face defined by high cheekbones and watchful eyes. She wore her hair in tight, natural curls pulled into a low, neat twist most days, practical, professional, and just slightly defensive as if she didn't want the world grabbing at her. She dressed with quiet precision, clean lines, neutral colors, shoes that were polished but never flashy. To strangers, she looked composed. To people who knew her well, she looked like someone who kept a door locked inside her chest. The glass tower of Harrington & Klein Tech rose ahead. Steel, chrome, and confidence. A corporate monument that reflected the city back at itself. Avery swiped her badge at the turnstiles and stepped into the lobby. The air inside was warm, scented with citrus and expensive cleaning products. A large screen played a looping video of happy employees smiling in slow motion. The same slogan repeated in white letters, "Innovation is our culture." Avery stared at it for half a second, then looked away. Upstairs, on the data strategy floor, the world narrowed. "Good morning, Avery." "Morning." "Hey." "Hi." Polite words, polished smiles. And then the looks. Small, quick, unspoken. Avery was the only black woman on the entire floor. Not new, not surprising, still heavy. Her co-workers were mostly white men in button-down shirts and white women in sleek blazers. They moved in little groups like schools of fish, laughing softly, sharing weekend stories, talking over each other with familiarity Avery never quite got invited into. Sometimes she tried, sometimes she didn't. Either way, she always ended up back at her desk, where the silence at least was honest. Her desk sat near a wall of windows that overlooked the city. Today, the rain turned Seattle into a watercolor painting. Gray sky, gray buildings, gray streets. The only bright thing on her desk was a small plant. A mini snake plant, tall stiff leaves streaked with green and pale yellow sitting in a simple ceramic pot. Avery set down her bag and touched one leaf gently, like checking a pulse. That plant had arrived months ago, on the same day she'd been officially assigned to Project Orion, the company's most guarded project, worth more money than some entire startups ever saw. Orion wasn't just software. It was a promise, a system designed to predict customer behavior at scale, what people wanted before they admitted it, what they feared, what made them stay, what made them leave. the kind of product that could make Harrington and Klein the crown jewel of the tech world. And Avery had built the heart of it. Not helped, not supported, built. She didn't talk about it in grand speeches. She didn't brag. She stayed late, rewrote broken logic, fixed other people's sloppy code, documented everything, and still showed up the next morning like it was normal. Because Avery's whole life had taught her something. If you're going to be the only one, you don't get the luxury of being average. The plant had been a gift from her husband. Ethan Johnson was 34, a systems engineer with the kind of patient intelligence that made people relax around him. He was tall, lean, and slightly sunbrowned from years of weekend hikes and working outdoors when he could. His hair was dark and a little wavy, often messy like he forgot mirrors existed. He had kind eyes, hazel with a tired softness, and a habit of listening fully before speaking, like he respected silence as much as words. Ethan wasn't loud. He wasn't dramatic. But when he decided something mattered, he became immovable. On the day Avery got Orion, Ethan had shown up at her apartment with the plant and a grin. "So you don't turn into one of those corporate zombies," he'd said. "You need something alive near you." Avery had laughed, kissed him, and placed the plant on her. Thursday afternoon settled over the city with a dull gray sky, the kind that pressed low against the glass towers of downtown Chicago. Inside Harrington and Klein Tech, the office hummed with its usual controlled urgency. Keyboards tapping, muted conversations behind frosted glass, the quiet confidence of people who believed they were building something untouchable. Avery Johnson sat at her desk, posture straight, shoulders slightly tense, preparing to upload the final internal build of Project Orion to the secure server for Richard Caldwell's evening review. Avery moved with calm precision. At 45, she carried herself with a restrained confidence shaped by years of being the only one who had to be twice as prepared. She was slightly curvy, her movements deliberate rather than rushed, dark curls falling softly to her shoulders. Her glasses reflected lines of code as she navigated the system she knew better than anyone else. Orion was not just a project to her, it was proof of her worth, written line by line in logic and structure. She clicked into the core directory and froze. The folder access log blinked on the screen, unchanged in appearance but devastating in meaning. The timestamp showed an unauthorized entry late the night before. Subdirectories had been opened. Files copied. Not deleted. Copied. A professional move. The kind meant to leave things looking untouched. Avery's breath slowed. She scrolled down. The last authenticated user, Avery Johnson. For a long moment, she didn't move. She didn't panic. Panic had never helped her survive rooms like this. Instead, she reread the log carefully, eyes narrowing behind her lenses. The access time didn't match her schedule. She had left before 9. The log showed activity after midnight. That alone should have mattered. But she knew how these things worked. Evidence was rarely read with context when fear was involved. She immediately opened her authentication history, checking token refreshes, IP addresses, session overlaps. There were irregularities, subtle ones, but enough to suggest credential misuse. She documented everything, took screenshots, and sent a calm, precise message to IT security requesting a review. Then she emailed Richard. Possible unauthorized access to Orion Core. Evidence suggests token compromise. I did not perform this access. She stared at the sent message longer than necessary. By Monday morning, the office felt different. Whispers followed her through hallways. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms. A security update was announced company-wide, framed as routine, but Avery noticed the way 2 compliance officers lingered near her desk longer than anyone else's. Then the news broke. A rival firm, Blackridge Systems, unveiled a demo at a tech symposium in San Jose. The headlines were immediate and brutal. Black Ridge reveals breakthrough customer behavior engine. Industry analysts were stunned by the similarities. The architecture, the predictive layering. Even the language used in the presentation echoed Orion's internal documentation. By noon, Harrington & Klein's stock dipped sharply. By 2, the board convened an emergency session. Richard Caldwell stormed into the conference room like a man carrying a fire behind his ribs. He was in his late 50s, tall, broad-shouldered, with silver threaded through his dark hair and a face permanently set in authority. His tailored suit couldn't hide the fury radiating from him. He slammed his palm onto the table, the sound cutting through the room. "This was an inside job," he said. His voice was controlled, but tight. Black Ridge didn't guess this. They didn't reverse engineer it, they had access. Eyes turned, slowly, inevitably toward Avery. She met them without flinching. "My credentials were compromised," she said evenly. "I flagged it the moment I saw the logs. It can confirm anomalies." Silence answered her. Not curiosity, not concern, just silence. One man shifted uncomfortably. Another avoided her gaze. No one spoke in her defense. Richard looked at the screen, then back at her. "You had sole access to the core build." "Yes," Avery replied. "And I warned months ago that single-user access without multi-factor at that level was a risk." That earned her a few stiff expressions, but no support. "We'll investigate," Richard said finally. "But until we do, you're removed from Orion effective immediately." The words landed cleanly, surgically. Avery nodded once. Understood. She gathered her things quietly. As she stood, she felt eyes on her. Some curious, some relieved, some almost satisfied. Madeline Pierce watched from across the room. Madeline was in her early 30s, tall and slim, with flawless posture and a practiced smile that never reached her pale blue eyes. She dressed impeccably, always perfectly aligned with the company's unspoken image of success. People liked Madeline, she made them feel seen. She laughed at the right moments, complimented the right ideas. But beneath the polish was a sharp ambition, hardened by years of being overlooked in her own way. Always good, never exceptional. Until Avery arrived. That afternoon, Madeline typed a short message on her phone, her manicured fingers steady. "It's done. Let it play out." That night, rain streaked the windows of Avery's apartment. The city lights blurred into muted gold and white, reflecting off wet pavement far below. Avery sat at her kitchen table, her coat still on, staring at the small green plant she had brought home from the office. The snake plant's leaves stood upright, stubbornly alive. She touched one gently, her throat tight. Her phone rang. Ethan. Ethan Johnson was a systems engineer with a calm presence that grounded everyone around him. In his late 40s, with warm brown eyes and a quiet strength, he was the kind of man who listened more than he spoke. He was calling from an airport lounge in Seattle, his jacket draped over his arm, travel-worn but attentive. "You sound tired," he said softly. "I'm okay," Avery replied after a pause. "Just a long day." He hesitated. "You sure?" She looked at the plant. "Yeah, I'm used to this." They talked about nothing important. Flight delays, weather, a restaurant Ethan had passed earlier. When they hung up, Avery sat alone, the rain tapping steadily against the glass. Somewhere across the city, Madeline closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, a slow smile forming. For the first time in a long while, she felt secure. And Avery, surrounded by silence, felt the first deep crack in the life she had worked so hard to build. The courthouse rose from the center of the city like a block of pale stone against a restless sky. It was early spring, cold enough that breath still showed in the morning air, but bright enough to expose every flaw. Wind funneled between buildings, tugging at coats and stirring loose papers on the courthouse steps. Avery Johnson paused for a brief second before entering, grounding herself. This was not a place of logic or code. This was a place of stories, and she knew how easily the wrong story could become truth. Inside, the air was heavy with polish and old wood. The courtroom smelled faintly of paper, metal, and long-settled decisions. Avery took her seat at the defense table alone. She had declined the company's recommendation to hire outside counsel, not because she thought she knew the law better than a trained attorney, but because she understood something deeper. Once someone else spoke for her, her voice would be filtered, softened, or shaped into something safer. She needed to speak plainly, precisely, and without permission. She wore a simple black suit, no jewelry except her wedding ring. Her glasses rested lightly on her nose, thin-framed, practical. Her dark curls fell freely to her shoulders, not styled for effect. She looked exactly like herself, and that mattered. Across the aisle sat Richard Caldwell. He did not look at her directly. He stared forward, jaw tight, hands clasped together as if holding something back. The anger in him had cooled into something heavier, disappointment mixed with fear. Richard was a man who had built his career on control. Losing it unsettled him more than betrayal ever could. The prosecutor rose first. Daniel Weiss was a tall, sharp-featured man in his early 40s, with narrow shoulders and a voice trained to sound reasonable even when accusing. His hair was neatly combed, his expression calm, almost sympathetic. He spoke as if he were explaining something obvious to a room of people who simply needed guidance. "The evidence will show," Daniel began, "that the defendant had exclusive access to the stolen data, motive rooted in professional dissatisfaction, and opportunity created by her position of trust." Avery listened without interruption. The first exhibit was the access log. Enlarged on a screen, her name appeared again and again beside timestamps and file paths. Daniel pointed with measured precision. "These are not guesses. These are records." Then came internal emails. Select lines were highlighted, phrases pulled from longer conversations. Avery watched as her own words were reframed. Concerns about security portrayed as frustration, technical objections painted as resentment. Next came the witness. Sarah Whitmore took the stand. She was a white woman in her early 30s, tall and thin, with straight blonde hair pulled into a tight low bun. She wore a conservative gray dress and held herself stiffly, hands folded in her lap. Sarah worked in project coordination, not engineering. She was known around the office as agreeable, someone who avoided conflict at all costs. Years earlier, she had been publicly blamed for a missed deadline that wasn't her fault, and since then she had learned to survive by aligning herself with power. "I saw Avery in the office late that night," Sarah said softly, after most people had left. Avery stood when it was her turn. She spoke clearly, without rushing. "I stayed late many nights. That was not unusual. But I left before 9. The log shows activity after midnight. That alone proves my credentials were used without my presence." She explained token hijacking in plain terms, describing how authentication keys could be copied and reused. She outlined the lack of multi-factor protection on the core system and referenced documented requests she had made months earlier to address that risk. She did not attack anyone. She did not plead. She simply explained. But the courtroom shifted uncomfortably. Technical language created distance. People leaned back, eyes glazing slightly. Complexity made them uneasy. Daniel smiled gently. "Ms. Johnson," he said, "is asking this court to believe that an invisible, highly technical failure occurred, conveniently absolving her of responsibility." Avery met his gaze. "I am asking the court to look at the facts." He turned to the jury. "Or perhaps a simpler explanation exists. Financial pressure. Opportunity. A competitor willing to pay." A murmur rippled through the room. From the back row, Madeline Pierce sat with her legs crossed, posture relaxed. She wore a cream-colored coat and subtle makeup, her lips curved in a faint, knowing smile. She looked like someone watching a performance she already knew the ending to. Avery noticed her and felt a chill run through her chest. Not fear, clarity. Madeline had always watched her that way, measuring, waiting. As the session continued, the judge, a heavy-set, balding man with silver hair around the sides and a voice worn smooth by decades of authority, listened in silence. He asked few questions. His eyes moved slowly between speaker and evidence, unreadable. When the court recessed for the day, Avery gathered her papers carefully. Her hands were steady, but inside, something had shifted. The room had accepted a story that required her guilt. Complexity had worked against her. Silence had followed her explanations like a shadow. In the hallway, reporters gathered. Questions flew. Did you take the data? Why didn't you hire a lawyer? Do you feel betrayed by your company? Avery said nothing. She walked past them, shoulders squared, eyes forward. Outside, the wind had picked up. Clouds rolled in darker now, the city dimming beneath them. Avery stood on the steps alone for a moment, then descended slowly. For the first time, she felt truly unanchored. Not because the case was going badly, but because she realized how few people were willing to see her as anything other than the role assigned to her. Behind her, the courthouse doors closed with a dull, final sound. The second week of the trial arrived with heavier skies. Rain fell in slow, steady sheets, turning the courthouse steps dark and slick. Inside, the air felt tighter than before, as if the room itself had learned what was coming. Avery Johnson sat at the defense table, her back straight, her hands folded calmly in front of her. She had slept little, not from fear, but from waiting. Today was different. Today, Richard Caldwell would speak. Richard entered the courtroom with measured steps. He looked older than Avery remembered. His shoulders slightly slumped, the sharp confidence that once defined him dulled by sleepless nights and mounting pressure. His tailored suit was still immaculate, but the man inside it seemed worn thin. To the outside world, Richard was a decisive executive. To Avery, he had once been proof that merit could matter more than appearances. She watched him take the stand, her chest tightening with a quiet, fragile hope. Richard had known her work. He had defended her ideas in meetings. He had called her indispensable. Surely, he would say at least one true thing today. The prosecutor's questions were calm, precise. They walked Richard through Orion's value, the damage caused by the leak, the trust placed in Avery's role. Richard answered evenly at first, his voice firm but controlled. Then came the question that shifted everything. "Mr. Caldwell," Daniel Weiss said, "looking back now, do you believe placing such a critical project in Ms. Johnson's hands was a mistake?" The silence stretched. Richard swallowed. His jaw tightened. He glanced briefly toward Avery, then away. "Perhaps," he said slowly. "I allowed my judgment to be influenced by optimism rather than reality." Avery's breath caught. "I believed," Richard continued, "that Ms. Johnson would integrate smoothly into the team, that her skills would outweigh differences. But in hindsight, I failed to consider whether she was truly aligned with the culture required for a project of this magnitude." The words landed like broken glass. He never said race. He didn't have to. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Avery felt heat rush to her face, then drain away, leaving a hollow cold. The man who had praised her now spoke of her like a calculated risk that hadn't paid off. Not a colleague, not a professional. A gamble. She looked at him then, really looked, and saw something new. Fear, not of her guilt, but of his own reputation, of shareholders, of headlines, of being wrong. Richard avoided her eyes. The prosecutor nodded slightly, satisfied, and moved on. The damage had been done. For a moment, Avery couldn't hear anything else. The courtroom blurred at the edges. Her thoughts raced, not in panic, but in disbelief. She had survived isolation, microaggressions, stolen ideas. But this was different. This was betrayal wearing a polite face. When it was her turn to respond, Avery stood slowly. The room quieted. She did not rush to speak. She let the silence exist. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "I don't need sympathy. I don't need excuses made for me. I need the truth to be examined with the same care as the accusation." She turned slightly, not to Richard, but to the court. "I was trusted with Orion because I earned that trust. Not because I fit a culture. Not because I was convenient. If believing in my competence is now considered a mistake, then the problem is not my work." Her words were clear, honest, unadorned, but truth, she was learning, could drown quietly when no one reached for it. The judge thanked her and called a recess. As the courtroom emptied, Avery remained seated for a moment, her hands resting on the table. She felt something inside her shift. Not break, but harden. Hope was fading. Resolve was taking its place. Across the aisle, Madeline Pierce rose from her seat. She adjusted her coat, her expression carefully neutral, though a flicker of satisfaction passed through her eyes. Madeline was not celebrating openly. She didn't need to. The system was doing the work for her. Outside the courthouse, the rain had turned heavier. Reporters clustered again, voices sharp and eager. Avery walked past them without stopping. She didn't hear the questions anymore. She only felt the weight of them pressing in from all sides. Across the country, in a crowded airport terminal, Ethan Johnson stared at his phone. Ethan stood near a large window overlooking the runway, his duffel bag at his feet. He looked out of place among the hurried travelers, still, focused, his brow furrowed. A message glowed on his screen, sent by a former co-worker of Avery's who had stayed quiet for weeks. "They're setting her up. She's the scapegoat." Ethan's jaw clenched. He read the message twice, then once more. He looked at the departure board. No flights would get him there in time. Not today. Not tomorrow morning. For the first time since this nightmare began, panic crept into his chest. Then, unbidden, his eyes drifted to the memory of Avery's desk, to the small green plant, to the thing he had installed months ago, not out of suspicion, but out of longing. Ethan closed his eyes. "There has to be another way," he whispered. Back in her apartment that night, Avery sat alone at the kitchen table. The plant sat near the window, rain tapping softly behind it. She turned the pot absently, noticing again its weight, its solidness. She didn't know why her gaze lingered there longer than usual. She only knew that something had changed. The last place she believed she was safe had rejected her, and yet, somewhere beneath the exhaustion, a quiet instinct stirred, telling her not to give up just yet. The courtroom felt smaller that morning, as if the walls had moved in overnight. The air was dry, tense, filled with the quiet confidence of a case nearing its conclusion. Avery Johnson sat at the defense table, hands folded, eyes forward. She had learned to read rooms like this, how certainty settled before truth ever arrived. The prosecutor stood and delivered what he called a preliminary conclusion. His tone was calm, almost apologetic, as if regret softened the weight of his words. Avery had motive, he said. Professional frustration. She had opportunity, exclusive access, and there was a technical evidence tied to her credentials. The story was clean, efficient, easy to accept. When he finished, the judge leaned forward slightly. His voice was firm but measured. "Ms. Johnson, the court will allow you one final opportunity to present direct evidence that you were framed." The room went still. Avery didn't speak right away. Her thoughts spun, not wildly but fast, too fast. She had facts. She had explanations. She had logic. But logic had failed her here. The court didn't want possibilities. It wanted something it could see. Her gaze drifted, unbidden, to a memory. Her desk by the window, rain streaking the glass, the small green plant standing upright and stubborn. Ethan's gift. Something alive in a place that often felt sterile. And then another memory surfaced. Small, strange, easily dismissed at the time. Weeks ago, while wiping dust from her desk, she had lifted the pot and noticed how heavy it felt. Heavier than soil and ceramic should be. She had never questioned it. Avery inhaled slowly, then exhaled. "Your Honor," she said, "may I request a brief recess?" The judge studied her for a long moment, then nodded. In the back of the courtroom, a man in a dark baseball cap shifted in his seat. Ethan Johnson had arrived quietly just minutes earlier, slipping into the last row like a shadow. He looked travel-worn. Creased jacket, faint stubble on his jaw, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, but alert, focused. Ethan was in his late 40s, tall and lean, with a stillness that came from years of solving problems by thinking them through rather than forcing them open. His hands rested loosely on his knees, but his gaze never left Avery. When the court recessed, Avery stepped into the hallway, her heart pounding harder now. She leaned briefly against the cool stone wall, steadying herself. Av. She looked up. Ethan stood a few feet away, eyes searching her face. Relief flickered across her features, then confusion, then something close to disbelief. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "I know," he said quietly, "but I had to be." He glanced around. No one was close enough to hear. From the pocket of his jacket, he pulled out a small, plain USB drive and pressed it into her palm. It felt warm, like it had been held too tightly. "In the plant," he said quickly, voice low and thick. "I put a mini camera inside the base, months ago." Avery stared at him. "What?" "I didn't tell you because it wasn't about suspicion," Ethan continued. "I was traveling all the time. I missed you. I just wanted to see you sometimes. Your desk, your smile when you were thinking." His voice broke slightly. "I never thought you recorded my office?" Avery asked, not angry, just stunned. "Yes," he said. "Only the desk, no audio. It overwrote every week. I checked it when I heard what was happening. I saw her." Avery's breath caught. Saw who? Ethan didn't need to answer. Back in the courtroom, the judge reconvened the session. Avery stood. "Your Honor," she said, holding up the USB, "I have newly obtained evidence that directly contradicts the prosecution's claims. I request permission to submit it." A murmur rippled through the room. The prosecutor objected, but the judge raised a hand. "Proceed." The USB was connected. The screen flickered, then stabilized. The video showed Avery's desk after hours. The lighting was dim, the city glowing faintly through the window behind it. Timestamps ticked in the corner. Then the door opened. Madeline Pierce stepped into frame. She moved cautiously, checking the hallway before approaching the desk. Her movements were quick, practiced, someone who had rehearsed this moment. She plugged a small device into Avery's computer, her fingers flying over the keyboard. She opened folders, copied files, then turned to the filing cabinet. She removed documents, photographed them with her phone, and slid everything back into place. Before leaving, Madeline adjusted the mouse and keyboard to their original positions. She smiled, briefly, privately, and walked out. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, chairs scraping. Madeline, seated near the back, went pale. Her confident posture collapsed inward, hands gripping the armrests. The smug smile she had worn for days vanished completely. Richard Caldwell stared at the screen, frozen. His face drained of color as realization hit. Not slowly, but all at once. The prosecutor stood speechless. Avery felt her hands shake, not with fear but with release. Months of being unheard, unseen, misjudged surged through her, then quieted. The truth was no longer abstract. It was visible, irrefutable. The judge leaned forward, eyes narrowed. Court will take this evidence under immediate consideration. Madeline was escorted out shortly after. Avery sank back into her chair, tears finally threatening, not falling, but close. Ethan caught her eye from the back of the room and gave a small, steady nod. For the first time since this began, Avery allowed herself to believe she might survive this. The courtroom no longer felt hostile. It felt exhausted. The energy that had once pressed down on Avery Johnson like a verdict waiting to be spoken now drained slowly from the room, leaving behind something unfamiliar. Space. The judge sat upright, glasses low on his nose, eyes fixed on the evidence projected before him. The video had already been replayed twice. The timestamps aligned perfectly with the access logs. The metadata confirmed the device, the hour, the machine. There was no room left for interpretation. Madeline Pierce stood at the center aisle, flanked by 2 court officers. Up close, she looked smaller than she ever had in the office. Her cream-colored coat hung loosely from her shoulders, her blonde hair no longer perfectly in place. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke, her voice quick and defensive. "It was a misunderstanding," she insisted. "I was asked to back up files. I didn't know—" The judge raised a hand. "Miss Pierce, the court has reviewed the footage. The actions recorded are deliberate and methodical." Madeline's words faltered. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for support that no longer existed. When she glanced toward Richard Caldwell, he looked away. Whatever protection she had believed she possessed had evaporated the moment the truth appeared on screen. Within minutes, the court ordered her detained for further investigation. The charges expanded quickly: corporate espionage, theft of proprietary data, conspiracy to sell, protected information to a competitor. As she was escorted out, her heels echoed sharply against the marble floor, each step sounding louder than the last. The silence that followed felt earned. The judge turned to Avery. "Ms. Johnson," he said, his voice firm but no longer distant. "This court finds that the evidence conclusively demonstrates you were not responsible for the theft of Project Orion. All charges against you are dismissed, effective immediately." Avery closed her eyes, not in relief alone, but in release. The weight she had carried for weeks slipped away all at once, leaving her momentarily unsteady. When she stood, she did so carefully as if learning gravity again. "I don't ask for sympathy," she said, her voice calm, steady, unmistakably her own. "I ask only to be judged by my work." There were no objections, no murmurs of doubt. Across the room, Ethan Johnson exhaled for what felt like the first time in days. He stood near the back, tall and still, his hands resting loosely at his sides. The tension in his shoulders eased, replaced by something softer. Pride, quiet and deep. Ethan had never needed grand gestures. Being there was enough. After the session ended, people moved awkwardly, unsure how to behave now that the story they had believed had collapsed. Avery gathered her papers slowly. She was not in a hurry. Richard Caldwell approached her near the aisle. Up close, he looked older than his years. The sharp authority that once defined him had been dulled by the realization of his own failure. His shoulders sagged slightly, and his eyes, once so confident, were heavy with regret. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "Not just about the project, about you." Avery met his gaze. She didn't interrupt him. "I failed to protect someone who earned my trust," Richard continued. "And worse, I let fear guide my judgment instead of facts. I'm sorry." Avery nodded once. She didn't offer forgiveness, and she didn't withhold it either. Some things needed time. Respecting herself meant allowing that distance. Weeks passed. Harrington and Klein Tech changed. slowly, under pressure and not entirely by choice. Internal reviews led to restructuring. Access protocols were updated. Multi-factor authentication was implemented across all sensitive systems, exactly as Avery had once recommended. Diversity audits were conducted. Mandatory training sessions followed. Some employees left quietly, others stayed, chastened. Avery returned, not as someone asking for permission, but as someone being asked to lead. She was offered the position of head of data security with clear authority and independence. No more being copied last. No more decisions made without her. Her office was modest but bright, with a wide window and a desk she chose herself. On the first day back, she brought only one personal item: the plant. The small snake plant sat near the window, leaves reaching toward the light. Avery had repotted it the night before, replacing the soil, cleaning the ceramic base carefully. She knew now what it had held, and why, but it no longer felt like a secret. It felt like a witness. At home, sunlight filled the apartment in the early morning hours. Avery stood by the window, watering the plant gently. The leaves caught the light, green and resilient. Ethan wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin lightly on her shoulder. "I won't hide things from you again," he said softly. She smiled, just slightly. "You can still miss me." He laughed quietly. "I do. Every day." She turned to face him. "Next time," she said, "just look at me." Outside, the city moved on. Traffic flowed. People hurried. Somewhere else, another injustice waited to be named. But here, in this small space filled with light and quiet growth, Avery Johnson stood whole. Not because the world had suddenly become fair, but because she no longer needed permission to belong. At the end of this story, the lesson is simple and deeply human. In everyday life, many people work hard, stay quiet, and do the right thing, believing that truth alone will protect them. But the world does not always reward honesty immediately. Sometimes, good people are misunderstood, blamed, or pushed aside not because they are wrong, but because they are different, alone, or inconvenient. Avery's journey reminds us that integrity may bend, but it does not break. Even when voices are ignored and doors seem closed, truth has a way of waiting for the right moment to rise. What matters is holding on to who you are, even when others try to define you for their own comfort. If this story touched you, take a moment to think about the people around you. The co-worker who stays silent, the neighbor who is judged too quickly, the person who carries more than they show. A little kindness, fairness, or courage can change more than we realize. If you believe that justice still matters, please share this story so it can reach someone who needs it today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Your voice matters here. Do not forget to like and subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing stories that speak to truth, faith, and resilience.